Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. I am out of the federal government as of about 3 weeks. Hair's beginning to grow back, and what's left that's grey is the grey's going away. So that's all good stuff. What I want to do in the time that I've got is to sort of shift gears some. And I recognize that the focus of this gathering is largely tracking of animals. I want to try to sort of throw the gauntlet out there to you all and say, the issues around food safety, as I'm sure many of you are aware, are much, much broader than that. And what I want to try to present to you in the next 20 minutes or so is that I think we're at a point where there are a lot of opportunities for the track and trace industry to grab this ball and run with it big time. And let me tell you why I say that. And what I'm going to do as I evolve through my talk, I will sort of bring us through broadly where some of the challenges for food safety are, high-level stuff. What are the concerns about food tracking? Why is it that the FDA is so focused on this? What have been some of the factors recently that have burnt the agency that they're trying to fix? Where's Congress going on this? Because believe me, those of you who are following this will know Congress are very clearly moving on product tracking. Will there be a requirement? And what's the FDA thinking on that as best I can provide that to you? And then where does this head in the future? So as we look at the broad picture around food safety, consumer demand for foods 24/7 year-round, driving the global food supply. This is not new. This is just the way it is. It isn't going to change. It's probably going to get worse. We're now at a point in the United States where about 15% of all the food that we consume is imported. Huge, huge differences. Aquacultured seafood is about 80%. Fresh produce, 50–60%, depending on the time of year and the type of produce. Other things, virtually zero, because it's entirely domestic. We're importing from over 150 countries. That's just FDA-regulated products. USDA is a lot simpler because of their equivalency. It's coming through every port in the United States. There are no limitations for FDA-regulated products. USDA products have limitations on the ports they can come through. Every foreign facility has to register if they are producing an FDA product to come into the U.S. As again, USDA is very different. It's a much more defined system. There are over 200,000 foreign facilities that are currently registered with FDA who are looking to import foods into the United States. That doesn't include farms. It doesn't include restaurants. The domestic equivalent to that is about 150,000 facilities. So we are talking here a massive universe of facilities through which food passes on an ongoing basis. The distribution systems are broad and fast. That's one of the challenges. It's a fact of life. They're getting broader and they're getting faster because essentially, in essence, to be profitable, you need to have speed. There's huge variations in practices amongst all of these facilities. Lack of clear preventive controls. Some firms, manufacturers, processors, growers have very strong preventive controls. Others just fly below the radar and hope that they're going to get away with it. If we turn this around to what are some of the impacts of this, we are getting greater recognition of outbreaks. If you look at some of the numbers over the last year or two of products that we've never seen before linked to human illness in the context of an outbreak, peanut butter being one of the classic ones, folk are saying, well, is the system deteriorating? Are we suddenly seeing problems in foods where we've never seen problems? I don't believe that. I think what we're doing is we're smarter at finding out those problems, and I believe they've probably always been there, and we just didn't know it. So there's greater recognition of outbreaks. That is combined with an erosion of public health infrastructure. And I just want to comment on what the Commissioner of Agriculture from Minnesota said. I could not agree more about the importance of the public health infrastructure at the state and local level. It's almost irrelevant what the feds do. If the state and local infrastructure isn't solid, it will not work, whether it's traceability or whether it's basic food safety. For some reason, there is focused media attention on everything to do with foods. We're just chatting before the session, and I speculate that spinach in 2006 somehow set this frenzy off. I don't know why, but my interactions with the media have been extensive, and they are very focused, very interested, and very smart about this stuff, and ask a lot of very penetrating and good questions. And I think it's important that they do that. The combined result is a complete loss of consumer confidence in the industry. If you look at the numbers, what do people feel about the safety of food? There are many who are saying, we're not confident, we're not comfortable, we don't want to eat imported products, we want to eat local, we don't want to eat anything that's rapidly distributed or widely distributed. And a lot of that is miscommunication and misinformation. To give you a couple of examples as to what's driving this recently, the gentleman from DHS talked a little bit about the Salmonella St. Paul outbreak. He showed you the epidemiology curve, showing you how that to be so massive, and if that was an animal illness issue, of how it would take off. I want to turn this in a different direction and talk about the traceability, which was a nightmare. End result of this outbreak was close to 1,500 cases in over 40 states. It began, as you'll remember, this time last year, a little earlier, in the May-June timeframe, when the illnesses were linked to tomatoes. FDA began to trace back those tomatoes. Where did you buy your tomatoes? Where did they come from? And those tracebacks very clearly led back to Florida and to Mexico with the same patterns. Now, either that means that the outbreak started in two countries at the same time, or it meant that something was wrong. Or thirdly, there's a possibility that it was a terrorist that put the identical genetic strain in two places at the same time. As you all again know, the subsequent epidemiology not only continued to suggest tomatoes are important, but that hot peppers were in on the act as well, somehow, somewhere. The traceback of peppers started in July. It led back to a distribution center in McAllen, Texas. The Food and Drug Administration went in there, got some samples of jalapeno peppers, tested them, and found the outbreak strain on those peppers in Mexico distribution facility, in the McAllen, Texas distribution facility. Turned out those peppers had come in from Mexico. So the next question was, so where in Mexico did they come from? And that led to the FDA teams going down into Mexico and asking the questions there. And finally, by the end of July, the agency found positive samples on a farm in Mexico. Now, this next slide illustrates a part of the Mexican traceability. There it is. I don't expect you to read it. It's impossible to read. It serves a purpose. But what you can see, perhaps, is some of the colors. And what we have over there in the red box that's over on the far side from me is, on that slide, is that distribution center in Texas that I'm talking about. And if you follow the red arrows, you'll see that they go up through a number of boxes way over to the top right-hand side of the slide and trace back to a farm in Mexico. On that farm, interestingly, they were growing both jalapeno peppers and tomatoes, but we didn't find the outbreak strain of Salmonella on there. When you look back towards the middle of the slide, there's a distribution center in Texas where all this other stuff is flowing through, peppers from other farms, other distribution centers in Mexico. And on one of those, that led back to a farm that's over there in the light green box on the right-hand side of the slide, in which the outbreak strain was found. That's where it was found, in irrigation water and on residual jalapeno peppers on that farm, the outbreak strain. So one could argue here that this traceback actually couldn't have been more perfect. It worked extraordinarily well. Disparate cases, multiple states. You've got a genetic type of salmonella that you can trace right back to peppers and irrigation water in a foreign country. That's pretty good. Unfortunately, Congress didn't see it that way, but it is actually technically pretty satisfying. The problem is it took a month. Meanwhile, the problems were continuing. Cases were continuing, consumer confidence was continuing to erode, and there was this whole question of, is it the tomatoes, is it the peppers, and meanwhile the industry was suffering. And the fact that this traceback took so long was a factor in that, there's no question. My second example is the peanut butter outbreak, which was Salmonella Typhimurium, which started in the September-October timeframe. This illustrates a whole other set of problems, which is, I think, is a good example of the dangers of an eroding public health infrastructure. People are getting sick in the September-October timeframe. It's not until January that this is figured out. And interestingly enough, once again, this is Minnesota coming to the rescue, and they figured it out that it was actually peanut butter in a nursing home. At that point, the initial traceability going back to, okay, where did this peanut butter come, was almost immediate. Within a matter of days, FDA knew that it had come from a small facility in Georgia, PCA. So the trace back was really fast and really efficient. But this guy was a small producer with a very wide distribution. Many didn't even know they'd received PCA products. And it turned out that the products from that manufacturer, the peanuts, the peanut butter, the peanut paste, had gone to over 400 recipients. Many of them not directly, they were secondary or tertiary consignees going down the line. They simply didn't know that the peanuts that they were using in their products to put down at the retail level had got a recall product in it. This led to protracted and extensive recalls. There was a total of almost 4,000 recalls running right through to June. So these recalls were continuing for almost 6 months because people did not know that they'd received PCA product. And again, this is not a trace back issue, this is a trace forward issue, depending on where you're standing in this. But the problem was at PCA, and it was impossible to know where that product had gone quickly. And this just illustrates the other piece of this. The tomatoes and the peppers are going backwards, and obviously this is going forwards. But I think my point is pretty clear. So where is Congress going on all of this? Well, as was mentioned earlier, there is a House bill that was passed, H.R. 2749, the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009. That has passed the House and is now out there. The comparable, somewhat comparable bill on the Senate side is S510. This was a bill that was put forward by Durbin and others, and is probably the closest thing that is coming out of the Senate. It's in a draft form. It's not been approved. It's not been passed by the Senate. And there are many, many new legislative requirements in these two bills. They go on for pages. Each one of them is about 120 pages long with multiple requirements in them. This slide summarizes some of the big ones, particularly in the House bill, which has got more detail and is of greater depth of requirement. For example, the requirement to register annually with a fee. The requirement to undertake hazard analysis and understand and implement preventive controls and develop a food safety plan if you are producing food. Requirement for the FDA to develop performance standards and determine which foods pose the greatest risk and what standards could be implemented to reduce that. There's very specific provisions in both of these bills on produce, which go right back to the grower in terms of the requirement for preventive controls for the grower, which is a new thing. There's going to be increased inspections, risk-based, but very much a significant increase in inspections. The House bill, which as I say is the one that's probably got the most traction right now, would require that every facility, wherever it is in the world, be inspected at least once every 4 to 5 years. If it's a high-risk facility, it would be every 6 to 18 months. If it's a lower risk, more like every 4 to 5 years, and there's an intermediate category as well. Now what this means is that they have got to be inspected on a regular basis. There are greater criminal and civil penalties if prohibited acts are found to have occurred. This country of origin labeling is back in. It's been on the table for a while. It is back in the bills as something that would be a requirement. Along with unique identifiers for food facilities, and in both of these bills, requirement for traceability. And I want to say a little bit more about that. First on the House side, which goes into a lot more depth than on the Senate side. So in H.R. 2749, which is the House bill, essentially the language in there is going to require the Secretary to, quote, issue traceback regulations that enables the Secretary to identify the history of the food in as short a time as practicable, but no longer than 2 business days. 2 days. Think of that Mexican deal, and we're going to have to do this in 2 days. Here's some opportunities, right? This has got to be for the U.S. and imported foods, so it's domestic and foreign. It's got to go all over the world, and it's got to be 2 days. And it needs to identify technologies. It doesn't seem to specify a technology, which personally I think is good. But it needs to identify technologies that will, bottom part of the slide, maintain the full pedigree of the origin and previous distribution. Link the history with subsequent distribution. Ensure the system is interoperable, and use a unique identifier for each facility. So this is really building a truly interoperable system. This is what's in the House bill. It's passed the House, it hasn't passed the Senate. So it has not passed Congress, and it doesn't have presidential approval yet. But it's important that I just lay this out in terms of where the House is going. Senate side is much less focused, much looser language, and essentially it's summarized by approving the ability to track and trace fruit and vegetables. It's a fruit and vegetable focus, it's not everything. The Senate is essentially requiring the agency, that is FDA, to develop a pilot project with the produce industry, to report back to them in 18 months, and then publish a notice of proposed rulemaking by 2 years. So the Senate side has got a lot less specifics, a lot less detail in it. So where's the FDA on this, or where was it when I left? Essentially, the problem is, the agency, as I've illustrated, it takes too long, and that is compromising a lot of issues. The peppers, tomatoes on the one side, the peanut products on the other side, it is taking too long. I don't think anybody would dispute that. And meanwhile, these things are continuing. The distribution's going on, the exposures continue, the illnesses continue, the problems mount, consumer confidence diminishes, and the liability climbs. So when you look at this side of it, there's a lot of potential return of investment of a traceability system that can nail the problem quickly. The difficulty comes because when you are investing in one of these systems up front, you're going to say, well, what are the chances I'm going to get a recall? Small, right? Well, yeah, but if you do, you could be in real trouble if you're dealing with a product that's got a very wide distribution system. In terms of the vision at FDA, the goal in the short term is to improve the current system, essentially to find a way to make it run faster with the current legislation, which is in the Bioterrorism Act of one up, one back, that doesn't go to restaurants and it doesn't go to farms. Where would it go in the future? Become more sophisticated. Allow the rapid tracing, multiple products may be implicated. So what does the agency appear to want from product tracing? Obviously, rapid determination of the contamination point to lead to containment and removal. It needs forward tracking information. Peanut butter is the classic example. That will enable the agency to get out in front on a forward situation, and then on a trace back, identify the cause of the problem. Try to then provide targeted information to consumers. Minimize the scope of the incriminated product. So we're not talking about a message that is going to essentially impugn the whole tomato industry, the whole pepper industry, the whole spinach industry, or the whole peanut butter industry. So you can narrow it quickly, and you can narrow it within the time frame of the attention of the consumer. And what that will do ultimately is to maximize the protection both for the consumer and for the industry. So it is a double hit that's a benefit. What are the important attributes that facilitate speed? Again, this is thinking from FDA. Unique identifiers allowing for connectivity. Consistent nomenclature for product throughout the supply chain. From my personal experience, we ran into some big problems tracing tomatoes because they literally change their name as they're moving through the system. It's the same case of product. As it moves from one person to another, they simply call it something else. It's important to have all points in the supply chain covered. These systems don't work if they don't go back to the farm if you're dealing with a product that's been grown on a farm. They don't work if you can't link up to the retail and the restaurant end to some degree or another. If you only have the middle part, it slows the whole system down. The need for electronic records is also important. Again, without specifying the system, but just the fact that you have this electronic interconnectability. And there are many systems out there that I'm aware of where this is now becoming a reality. And the interoperability of these systems will allow for the connectivity with all of those handling the product. So I think there are multiple ways to get there. Some of the challenges around this whole approach is obviously it's only as strong as the weakest link. And I forget who had the slide, but in the earlier session where I think a gentleman, maybe it was Doug from I forget who it was, demonstrated that if you've got traceability systems in covering 50% of the animals, it only gives you a 10% benefit. You've got to get way up there to 95% to really start to get some return and some coverage. So if you only have a part of the industry that's part of this, it isn't going to work. And it was very interesting in the tomato and peppers situation. It was not the big guys. It wasn't the big retailers and the big restaurant chains. It was the little guys where these problems were occurring. And the big industries have many of these systems in place already. The technological barriers are significant, but personally I think that they are diminishing on a daily basis. I think there are many systems out there, and I'm sure many of the vendors in this room would agree with me that these technological barriers can be overcome. The problem is that the food industry, and I paint this picture very broadly, is nervous of those technological barriers. They think it's going to be expensive, difficult, it's not going to give them a return of investment, and it's just going to be a technological challenge that they don't want to deal with. So the cost of implementation and maintaining the system is a challenge that's very much perceived by the food industry. And obviously the need for the system to be international creates another layer of challenge on top. So where's all this headed? I've talked about obviously the very broad food safety issues that are a major focus of the White House, of Food and Drug Administration at HHS, as well as USDA and Department of Homeland Security. Congress is all fired up about this. The House have moved fast and furious. It's a good question as to whether the House, with all the health care reform, will be able to focus on food safety when they come back in a week or so. I wouldn't like to put money on it either way, but it is interesting how quickly the House moved food safety legislation, despite health care reform being a major factor for them before they went on their August recess. So I think if I had to guess, I would say it's more likely than not that this new legislation will come out in one way or another. I think there is the political will to push it forward. So there will be new regulations. What they will look like is probably some mix between the House and the Senate. There's clearly going to be stricter requirements for imports, which is likely to include some sort of traceability system, but at this stage we don't exactly know what. There's going to be increased inspections and penalties, as I talked about. There is unquestionably going to be more enforcement from the Food and Drug Administration. The Commissioner for Food and Drug, Dr. Hamburg, has already made that statement publicly. The agency is going to do more enforcement. The agency, FDA, is being more proactive. They are getting out there. They are looking for problems and jumping on them. And I think it's highly probable that there will be some level of requirement about traceability. My hope is that what will be required is pilot studies to figure out what's going to work optimally, because I don't think anybody knows. If you were to specifically say to the FDA, okay, so what's your perfect system? I don't think you'd get a solid answer, because I don't think the agency has the perfect system figured out. So what I was advocating when I was there was pilots. Let's figure out, working with different sectors of the industry, because it's a whole different deal if you're trying to trace back a tomato or a pepper than if you're trying to trace back the components of 50 different ingredients going into some final processed product that's come from 30 different countries. Very different challenges. What are the solutions? Well, I think, and this is a sort of general message, is with all this change going on, I think it's important to stay ahead of the curve, to stay informed. There's a lot going on in the Hill, there's a lot going on in Washington in terms of moving this stuff forward, and it will suddenly take off. And I believe that the political will to drive this stuff fast and furious in the next 2 years is very much there. I think the Obama administration want to make capital out of protecting the food supply, of moving forward on food safety, which is good for public health. Can't argue that. And therefore they will be wanting to move fast. How do you deal with that? You've got to build collaborations. If everybody hunkers down and squirrels into a corner, it isn't going to work. There's got to be collaborative approaches between the food industry and those with the technology to help address traceability specifically, and anything else that I've discussed really. There needs to be a focus on the science, and then the force to drive the policy. That's a challenge, but again, I think that's a general term in terms of the solutions around preventive controls and some of these other issues. And then finally, acknowledging what I said in my introductory comments about the power of the media and social networking. It is a very powerful force, which, to large intents and purposes, I think has been extremely successful in disseminating information. And my advice would be for us to find ways to use the power of that system, to disseminate good information about how the industry, both on the technology side and on the food production side, are stepping up and creating solutions to solve these problems as a sort of collaborative approach. Finally, with all this activity going on, I think there are three choices. Change is inevitable. It is coming. It's beginning to happen already. And number one, we could fight it, and we can fight the change, and we can hunker down. And I think there's little doubt that the outcome of that will be that you'll lose. You can accept the change. You'll probably survive. You may not, but likely you'll survive. Or frankly, you can take the third approach, which is lead the change. And if we lead the change, then I think that there's a chance that we'll be able to get out in front. There'll be profit to be made. There's solutions to be had, and it will help public health, and it will help essentially protect elements of the food industry who, without some of this leadership, are going to struggle, whether it be on the technology side or on the food production side. So obviously, I'm advocating for collaborative approaches. Take the leadership step, which is something we heard in the previous session as well, and that's going to involve working together as a team to address these problems.